Welcome back to another episode of the BSB Podcast. In today's episode, we're discussing Broadway's Operation Mincemeat, the musical proving once and for all that the pen, the plan, and a good power ballad can win the war. But before we explore the war briefings of this hilarious musical, please like, follow, and subscribe to the BSB Insider on all social media platforms at bsb.insider. Spoiler warning, if you have not seen Operation Mincemeat and wish to remain unspoiled, pause this video and return once you've received your orders from the General. If you're still here, let's dive in. So, we're back from New York. Congratulations, we made it through a week of shows. And I am so glad we got to see this, but I feel like when we jumped into Operation Mincemeat, not that I was dragging you, but you did not know exactly what was going on with the show, so you weren't as excited as I was, correct?
Yes. I mean, like, literally the name, all I knew was the name.
Sure.
That's literally all I knew. And I was like, why would we go see a show about meat?
I mean, which is fair, because again, this is a transfer from the West End that came to Broadway. And so it wasn't a show that like maybe was always on your radar. So you knew nothing about the show.
Correct.
Did you know anything about the history of Operation Mincemeat, like the true story?
Didn't know it was a true story.
So as we're walking in to the theater, you were pleasantly learning so much about this show.
I mean, still even probably a good quarter. I mean, as it does take time when you see a new show for the first time, figuring out, having any idea. I mean, obviously I saw the stage because there's no curtain for this show. But yeah, I was, up until that point, I was clueless.
Okay, so I do need to know your first impressions. As you're walking into the theater, as you said, there's no curtains, which I forgot until this moment that you mentioned it. What was going through your mind as we're walking in and you're seeing what is essentially like an underground bunker on stage?
I mean, yeah, it reminds you of like literally every spy movie ever. And I have watched plenty of spy movies, so it was like that mixed with possibly like Batman.
That is a good way to describe it. That's fair. Because like it is kind of, I mean, Batman also has that feel of like a 1940s World War II bunker, you know, or like the Batcave does at least. So with this being based on a true story, I don't want to say it is a true story because obviously nobody can truly portray a story that's old, and obviously this one takes comedic license with the story. But we are telling the story of Operation Mincemeat, which is the plan for the Axis to trick the Axis powers into thinking that we weren't invading Sicily, but Greece, Sardinia. What is just striking about the story to you? Like, what do you think really stands out about the story of both the true story and the musical Operation Mincemeat?
I mean, they lean into the bizarre immediately, right? Because like, how else can you? Otherwise, you're like setting the tone for basically Frankenstein a little bit. It feels.
Oh yeah, shit! I didn't think about that.
Yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind when we talk about, the body, and shipping it off, and all of the things, but a little more humor with that. It definitely gives Mel Brooks, which even in their publicity, they even say like this is a mixture of Six, Hamilton, and a Mel Brooks show. So it very on brand for what they said you were going to get.
So before I dive in too much about it, I do want to say that is an excellent mixture. Again, I knew a little bit about this. I had people that had told me about Operation Mincemeat, why I needed to see it, why it was such a good show. I had seen that it kept getting extended because this is a show that was going to be here for like 8 weeks, and then it was like 16, and now I think they just extended it for another 20 weeks. Like this is a show that just keeps on going. But it truthfully is like the Hamilton of like it's telling history but maybe not accurate history, but they're telling history. And then the history of 6, where we're kind of having fun with history. Not that Hamilton isn't having fun, but Hamilton's a little more of like an expected historical show. I would feel like, you know what I mean? Like in the veins of like we're telling the story through hip hop, but it's like it still feels very history-esque kind of living there. And this one in Operation Mincemeat is 100% like we are just talking about how fucking bizarre this story is and how ridiculous it is, but it's also true. You know what I mean?
Yeah, obviously massive comedic license because the story is only being told by a handful of people comparatively to the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that would have been involved in said operation.
And so, for the people who aren't familiar with Operation Mincemeat, the story is that while we're trying to trick the Axis powers, the MI5, it's MI5, correct? Yeah, making sure. I don't know my spy stuff as much as I should, but MI5 is basically trying to find a way to trick them, and they're trying to come up with plans. And so we really kind of follow a set of like 5 characters, but really it's kind of the story of Charles and Montague, which I found it funny that we use Charles's first name in the show and Montague uses his second name, which I think looks towards the power dynamics, which we can talk in a little bit of the show. But we truly are the 2 brains behind this operation, which is to get a dead body, put it in a submarine, ship it off, and have it have fake plans that the Axis powers are going to fall for. And I know what you're thinking, listeners. Right away, you're thinking, like, this sounds ridiculous. This cannot be true. And I thought the same thing as we're watching the show. I was like, this, like I knew it was true. I knew going into this it was true. But, like, who's going to fall for plans like this, right? Like, were these thoughts going through your head as well?
I don't know that I was thinking so much about the historical aspects or accuracy just because, again, there's so much happening. It's very hard to realize it as factual because of just the nature of the way it's being portrayed.
For sure. Let me ask you this. Why is this story worth telling? Like, what is it about Operation Mincemeat that seems like that this is the time to tell this story and that people are so darn intrigued with it?
Well, how deep do we want to go?
Listen, I got a rabbit hole and you can go down it.
I mean, we're in a place in the world currently where I think there's a lot of curiosity around, unfortunately, around violence, around war, around all of these things. And to then have it put in a way that feels less threatening and makes light of what ultimately was an incredibly dark situation, um, makes us feel kind of safe. And so that is, I think, the genius of a show like this, where how many people are going to sit through a play? Like, if this had been a straight show without comedy, how many people would have shown up? I don't think it would have had nearly the same reception.
I would agree with that. I think that, I like to call it the Mary Poppins effect, that we truly do sometimes need that spoonful of sugar to really digest the messages and or just like the fact of like life is very chaotic right now. And this is a story that kind of mimics some things that are going on right now. And so to have a story that is just kind of like you're laughing about it, but as you're laughing, you're leaving and you're like, how does that relate to our own life? This show does that. And there's even parts where they kind of call you to it. They're talking about like, oh, this could never happen in the future, or this won't be like this. And like it is mimicking that. So I do think that it is a really intriguing way of telling a really interesting story, but also to get audiences on board with the depravity that is sometimes happening in our world.
Yeah, and I won't skip to the end and spoil it for everyone, but I think there's full circle moments, right? Like where there is callback to, yes, we've just spent all this time making fun and cracking jokes and doing musical numbers, which automatically feel maybe light or satirical, and then we do have a few moments of like appreciation of the reality and the depth of what actually went down.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of depth in the second act that I wasn't expecting, because the first act is kind of light. You're kind of romping through the fact that we're getting to the point where we're dropping a body into the ocean, um especially, again, I think that, and we'll talk about the characters in a little bit, but Charles was a favorite for me, because he was so comedic in this show. Maybe it was also because he was a nerd, and I appreciate the nerd aspect of it, but you're kind of having this fun romp. Like, I can't even describe it, because it reminded me again of like a James Bond film, but it's funny. It's not serious. They're not taking themselves seriously. And then like things turn very serious for a moment there, when it looks like everything's going to fall apart, especially between the characters that we know, like the relationships that we've kind of grown to see interact in this show. And I don't think I was expecting that from the show. I thought it was gonna be like, almost like a pure comedy, and then it was something deeper, which was kind of striking about this.
Yeah, and I think you need that in order to have those full circle moments, or even the callback to what people have experienced in their own lives. That brings a sense of groundedness or humanity to the story that maybe we weren't getting through the sheer comedy portion.
In this show as well, they tackle quite a bit of topics, and in my head, I'm thinking that we're talking about like gender expectations, in the 1940s, and we're talking about betrayal from our friends, and we're talking about the literal like safety of the world. You know what I mean? Like, it is, at times it does feel cataclysmic. And what I love about the show too is that it never makes it feel like what's happening in the larger world, so like what's happening during World War II, was any more important than what's happening in the relationships. And I'll explain why this is important to me, because I always go back to my psychologist roots here. And I think that sometimes when the world is imploding, we feel like we almost feel guilty to remember that like we have personal lives, and that things feel heavy for ourselves, and that we feel like we're being let down, or we feel like, we're being hurt, or we don't like how we're being treated, or that we feel bad for having a good time. And what I like about the story that these four wrote, the four main stars of the show, who wrote the book and the music of the lyrics, is that they both, like, they gave you time to appreciate the fact like you can have personal issues and not have to feel bad about it. I always kind of go back to, I remember as a kid we were told like to clean your plate because there were starving kids in Africa, which is like wrong on so many levels. But part of that is that like just because somebody else is suffering doesn't mean you can't also have a bad day, doesn't mean you also can't have your own personal conflicts, and that doesn't mean that they're not important. So I liked that throughout the story of Operation Mincemeat, we had these interpersonal relationships that were just as important as the fact that we are trying to save the world from the Axis powers. And I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but that was one thing I kind of picked up on through the narrative of the show.
Agreed. That I think, well, and that's just it, right? The balance of making you think a little bit deeper or connect. Because most of the people in the audience, let's be real, you weren't connecting to being a spy, right? You weren't connecting to being in the midst of a war, because a lot of us haven't lived that, fortunately. And so, unless you were literally in the military or a spy, there's no way to relate aside from the humanity that the show also focuses around.
Did you think there was going to be that much humanity? Again, you didn't know much about the show. I get it, but like,
Yeah, I mean, it didn't shock me because you do need some kind of alternative anchor. Like you can't just have comedy. The show wouldn't be nearly as impactful and I think nearly as successful if it had just been straight comedy with nothing else in it. Because people like to connect, and when they feel connected, that's the draw. And the laughter is just an added bonus.
so I'm going to connect it to another show real quick, and I just want your opinion on this. What about a show like Book of Mormon, which doesn't have a lot of depth to it and is very just pretty much comedy, like that works for that show. Do you think that could work for a show like this? Like, you don't think that, like, I'm like wondering, like, do you think that, like, if it was just laughter after laughter after laughter, it would still, I mean, I guess maybe it wouldn't have won the Tony then, you know what I mean?
I mean, yes, but I would also argue that there's an equal amount of humanity in that show as well, because you have a
Okay.
story about two people who were started as strangers and then became best friends. And you have the religious aspect where so many of us were raised with some kind of religion or now are a part of faith or religion or spirituality, whatever you want to call it. And so the extremism, like we all know a little bit that, like, maybe unpopular opinion, but like most religions are kind of cults, right? Like no matter what the religion is, that's just what you're following something. And so exaggerating that and kind of exposing that, but then being able to laugh about it because we all know kind of it's true. Um, I could see that very similar kind of humor, um, but similar relational connection as well.
You know, it's interesting as you're talking about like the cult aspect of it as well. I was drawn to the fact in Operation Mincemeat, they don't actually say it, but they allude to the fact that like being a government official is also kind of like a cult. You know what I mean? Like you just take your orders and you follow them, but sometimes every once in a while you get to push back. And I feel like this was kind of seen in the Montague and Charles relationship, where Natasha Hodgson's character was very much like the, you don't have to be so scared. Like you don't have, like, yes, you have a general who's telling you what to do, but like your job is also to like give your points of view, and you're an expert in your field. And yeah, you're a little weird, but like you're just as important in this as well. Like where Charles at first was very much like the follow the rules, do what you're told, don't interrupt, don't make a fuss. And so it's interesting that also kind of parallels what you were saying about Book of Mormon.
Yeah, and I think it's that exaggerated kind of pompous character of like, I don't have to follow the rules versus the polar opposite, right? Like where I'm following every stingy rule that there is and following that or finding that middle ground, which most of the time seems near impossible. But I think that's kind of where this show finds landing or I guess a sweet spot.
I mean, yeah, the show did find the landing on Sicily's ground. So, uh, but come on, that was good. Um, I do want to talk about another aspect of the show, but I feel like to talk about it, you have to talk about the performances as well. So we have 5 people on stage. We had 2 understudies for our show, which does not really negate what we're about to talk about. Um, and we are going to talk about their individual performances in a second. But something that the show does, and I always want to kind of get your point of view because just I think it's interesting, is that gendered roles don't really exist in the show, and I think that's interesting. So Natasha is playing a male role, you know, and then you have Sam, who is the understudy, playing Hester. You know, you have Zoe, who's playing the general, who is a man role as well. Like, what do you think of like the fact that they kind of took a story? I think like in my head, kind of like Hamilton, where they took these characters, these real people, and then they adapted them a little bit, and like it changes like how you reflect on the story. What did you think of kind of like the gender swapped characters and how that played into the dynamics in the show? That was a mouthful. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I mean, just as you were saying that, it got me thinking about how had this been the early days of theater and had it only explicitly been men, which it was, men play women's parts regularly and no one bats an eye. But for some reason, it feels different for women to play men.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it feels like a new idea. Like we're just now discovering, and not in a drag kind of way, although it kind of is a little bit. It could be, but it's not exaggerated. It's just yeah, this woman is playing a man, and you're just accepting. Or maybe I shouldn't even be using the term man. Maybe I should just say male presenting. I'm honestly not sure how the show in the book is written.
Sure.
Because it seems very intentional. Like, we intentionally have someone who's female identifying playing a male identifying role, and vice versa. Or we're stretching the gender binary in general, which I think this show does tackle, without making it a plot point, which I appreciate.
Yes.
I think it's one of the first shows where that also is probably why it's doing well, because it's just this unspoken thing that's ultimately proving that it doesn't matter.
Right.
And I think we saw something similar with Hamilton, right? Where we had people of color who were playing what used to be uh, predominantly white roles, or vice versa, to the fact where, like, it didn't matter. Um, like, those roles were no longer explicit to any given group. I guess I don't want to say it doesn't matter. I think it was intentional, so I think it does matter. But in regards to being historically accurate or what have you, um, yeah, I think it's a little bit groundbreaking, especially for Americans.
Sure. And I do want to say along those lines, we have many different levels of queerness in the show. Um, the individual who won the Tony for Hester is like gender nonconforming or non-binary. And so like there's all these different ways of like you said, like we're taking a different approach. And when you talked about the novelty of maybe like women playing male presenting roles or like female presenting individuals playing those kinds of roles, I remember being kind of struck at how cool and novel it felt in Suffs when we had Woodrow Wilson being played by a woman, and like that was really cool in that one. And when you're talking, I was like, that's the only instance I can really think about in recent Broadway years where we had a role like that, and it felt. And I hate to use the word novel because I don't want to think of it as like a novelty, but like it just felt so new.
Well, and just a couple streets down, I can't even remember what blocks they were both on, but on the flip side of that, in the same breath, you have O'Mary, which is a
Correct.
comedy in which um they've got all kinds of gender fuckery happening, right? Like, sometimes we've got cis women playing the role, sometimes we have gender nonconforming or non-binary or trans people. Like, it's just all over. Um, but it does tend to be usually in a comedic fashion, I would say. Probably as kind of a little bit of a safety net, because, like, we're not ready for the non-gendered really non-gendered roles. Um, that would be interesting to me. Well, and again, I would be very interested in looking at this book, because what if originally they weren't gendered and we just are putting whoever can hit those notes and act in that role? Like, who's to say that if this production doesn't eventually tour or what have you, that the roles could be completely flipped? We don't know.
It's interesting because when you talk about that, and not I'm trying to get too off the subject of Operation Mincemeat, but I recently read that in Shucked, the role of Lulu is written as like gender nonconforming ish. Like anybody can kind of play the role as long as they can play the role. You know what I mean? Um, so it's interesting that you say like there's kind of this, and then if you're talking about Shucked, we had Alex Newell in our Chicago playing, as a trans individual, a non-binary individual playing a role such as that, and like nobody's batting an eyelash on that one, but that one's a more serious role. So I was just trying to say like there is this kind of change to the gender binary, but I was really cool to see in Operation Mincemeat that it didn't really matter how you identify or how you present. You're just playing a role. It almost feels like it's built on talent and not on what people think you should be playing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's literally based on the characterization that you're presenting rather than the assumption of characterization that the audience is putting on the actor.
Correct. And speaking of that, so we're gonna dive into the characters a little bit. So again, with the story kind of being about Montague and Charles, I feel like even though this is an ensemble piece, they really felt like very two main characters, especially because a lot of the other ones were switching in and out to kind of tell their story. Um, but of the five, whose performance really hit you? And again, listeners, I want to just preface by saying we had two understudies in our show of five. So like two-fifths of our show were individuals who did not originate the roles. So take it away, RJ. What struck you?
I mean, Natasha was incredible.
Yeah.
Um,
The swagger of Montague. Like,
yes. I mean, just, and even so, even being basically, I mean, they all, because there's only five of them, they all are on the stage basically 100% of the time.
mhm.
But I would say they were predominant, like, but they were playing Montague for the longest amount of time as a primary role compared to everyone else who was flexing between the 72 characters that they were covering. Um,
It literally said their character's name and others for
yeah.
you know what I mean?
And so obviously though, when you, much like Lin-Manuel with Hamilton, when you write something and you've lived with it for years, it's next level. Like it's the way that you're breathing like the character. Um, and so you can just tell there's just a difference because I mean, they could do it in their sleep and arguably, half of the cast, they've been doing this or been a part of the production process for years. Um, but yeah, whether it was a character preference or just I also just really enjoyed their voice was felt very unique to me. Again, we don't hear like female voices that are intentionally lowered too often. Not that they didn't sing high too, but it was definitely like an alto, I would guess, in a lead role, which we almost never see, especially on Broadway. So it was different. It was fun. And very, very well done.
It was definitely really cool. And I loved that Montague was just so like you almost wanted to hate him, and yet Natasha still made him feel likable. And again, I feel like that happens with a lot of spy stories, you know what I mean? So I do have to give mad props to that. Um, obviously, I love Charles. David Cumming was fantastic as this nerdy, over the top, kind of cartoonish, and a lot of these characters did feel kind of cartoonish. You know what I mean? You could see them in like a 1960s Rocky and Bullwinkle episode almost. It felt very much of that frame. I think that the biggest surprise for me was Sam Hartley as Hester, which again was an understudy. And as RJ can attest, there was one part in the show that I was literally crying my eyes out. Um, and I was really impressed with Sam's performance of Hester. Like mad props to that.
Do you need a moment? Should we get you some tissues right now?
Listen, we'll talk about that in episode 2. Um, were there aspects of this narrative or this story that didn't work? Or were there like parts of the characterizations that you felt didn't fit with the rest of the show?
Honestly, no. I mean, you're thrown around a lot because there's a lot of jumping. You have to, I would say, have a creative mind or leave your mind open for creativity because the set does not change. I mean, it does, but only with props, really. Or very like small moving pieces, I would say, and projection. So you have to be very into the farce aspect that's happening and very quick at a very quick pace. And you have to be paying attention. Like, if you're snoozing on anything, you're going to lose where you are in the show because it's incredibly fast-paced.
Real quick before we let the listeners go, I do want to touch on that. Yes, this is very farcical. We have not seen a farce like this on, I guess, Oh Mary's also a farce with the door slamming and stuff like that. But like, I cannot remember the last time we went to a Broadway show where we actually had like a true farce such as these two.
Yeah, I don't know that we've seen another one.
Is farce coming back? Is this making a return, RJ?
Well, honestly, I think it's the first musical farce I've seen. Like, I don't recall. Usually farce is just farce. It's a straight show. It's a lot of physical acting and running around. And literally off the top of my head, I can't think of one other one.
So that's your goal today, listeners. If you know of another farcical musical, drop it in the comments, shoot us a message on any of the social medias and let us know, because we can't think of a single one, unless Boop, but we didn't get to see Boop. So that could be our farcical musical that we missed. But on that note, we are running out of time. So stay tuned for part 2 of our Operation Mincemeat discussion. Thanks again for joining us here in our box seats. Until next curtain call.